All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming back. It gives me a second chance to introduce Lourdes in case I messed up the first time. So our next and final speaker will be Lourdes Aleman from the Teaching and Learning Lab here on campus. The question previously was about, how do we get people to sort of engage in these systematically across MIT? Hopefully, many of you have engaged with the Teaching and Learning Lab. That's what its mission is here at MIT. It's a thin staff, but they really sort of try to reach across the institute in supporting both faculty and graduate students in their teaching efforts. Lourdes previously did her PhD here in biology, worked in open learning, so has been deeply engaged with the disciplines and educational technology for many years now. So thanks for coming and speaking today.
So thank you so much for still being here, right, and staying for this talk. Thank you, Eric, for that lovely introduction, and for Sam for inviting me to speak today. My name is Lourdes Aleman, and as Eric said, I'm a member of the Teaching and Learning Lab, and we are tasked with supporting teaching and learning at large at MIT, which means that I get to talk to a lot of faculty, but also graduate students and postdoc about teaching. And you can imagine there's a lot of conversations that take place around the AI, and I seem to see sort of like two kinds of responses or reactions, which I think have been brought up today here as well, and are mimicked by some of the headlines that we encounter and see in popular press, that of consternation and anxiety, as well as some, positivity and over-optimism in some cases. So I think AI is presenting both a challenge and an opportunity, and I share some of those concerns with you all. In terms of an opportunity, I think AI is really shining a spotlight on our education system and kind of helping us reassess and reimagine what it is that we're doing in our classroom. So in that sense, I'm going to be focusing our attention with that in mind to talking more about how we teach in our classrooms. So the lens that I'm going to use are learner-centered teaching practices. So what are these things? What do these terms mean? These are evidence-based teaching practices that not only are they more effective for student learning, but also have been shown to provide an inclusive, welcoming learning experience for our students. And if you take one of our teaching certificate programs, you will be, which you can if you want to, but there's a host of practices that we talk about there. We will not have time in the 20 minutes that I have to be able to even scratch the surface of why you might want to incorporate some of these in your classroom. I would say I have no trouble getting our graduate students and our postdocs sort of becoming, getting on board with these practices. It's a little bit more difficult with faculty who have perhaps less time and other incentives to be able to re-engineer, reconceptualize their teaching. So I think that AI actually is sort of in many ways shining a spotlight on the importance of these teaching practices, which we have already kind of observed and heard in many of the speeches the talks that we heard this morning. So I'm going to talk about basically 3 of these practices. Most of our time is going to be spent on the very first one, backward design, which has a lot to do with how we conceptualize course design. So let's look at backward design. So to talk about backward design, I have to talk about traditional course design. So in a traditional course design, we start with content. Content drives, right, typically a list of topics. And that list of topics then tends to drive what we teach in the classroom. And then the assessments after that, that we sort of design for our students. And in actual practice, what tends to happen a lot of the time is that the assessments become sort of an afterthought. And there can be a lot of misalignment between what we intend to teach in the classroom and when we assess our students outside of the classroom. And I won't give you any names, but I think all the classes I ever took at MIT would be good examples of this misalignment. Between what is intended and what's actually to assess and what's actually taught in the classroom. So in contrast to that, we have something called learner-centered course design. There, we don't begin with the list of topics. Actually, we begin with the question, what it is that we want our students to know and do by the end of this course. And you've heard this term talked about already, called learning outcomes. And basically, learning outcomes drive everything else. So the learning outcomes will drive the assessment design. So how am I going to know that my students are actually attaining those learning outcomes, right? What's the evidence that I can design to be able to see that? And then that in turn then drives the active learning activities, the in-class learning activities that can support, right, the attainment of those learning outcomes. So in the end, you end up with a system that has many benefits. One is this full alignment between all of these components. So they're all there to support each other. It makes it easier for you as an instructor to make decisions about what you teach, because we know there's way too much content. And so having very clearly articulated learning outcomes makes it a lot more likely that you can make some tough decisions about what to cut. If it's not serving those learning outcomes, you don't teach it, right? And also, it makes it much more likely that your students understand what it is that they need to do in your course to succeed, right? So in actuality, this is a very dynamic process. I don't want to give you the perspective that flows in this sort of very linear fashion. There's a lot of feedback loops that happened between these components, and this is what we call backward design. And backward design is not too dissimilar from the kind of processes that we engage in research. In research, we tend to typically start with questions that we want to answer. And that drives, in turn, the methods, the strategies, the experiments that will show, right, that will answer those questions for us. So I would argue that in the era when so many of these tools can do so much of the thinking for our students, it behooves us not to actually employ a very intentional process that allow us to examine what it is that we want our students to know and do by the end of our courses. So let me begin by giving you an example of what I mean by talking more about learning outcomes and assessments. So some of you have probably seen this before. This is called Bloom's taxonomy. If you have, can you please raise your hand so I know how many of you? Wonderful. OK. So for those of you who haven't seen this before, I'll give you a brief intro. So Bloom was an educational researcher that in the 50s designed a taxonomy to help teachers classify, identify, and come up with learning activities based on a range of complexities, right? So we see that Bloom's taxonomy has 6 different levels. It tends to be represented in this hierarchical format because the lower levels tend to be encompassed by the higher levels. And basically, the lower levels are lower order cognitive tasks, and the higher levels are the higher order cognitive tasks. So the analysis, evaluation, and creation kinds of tasks. And that's where critical thinking really truly lives, in those higher order cognitive tasks. So what learning should we emphasize, right, in this era of AI? What kinds of learning tasks should we provide for our students? I'm going to say that there are examples of usage of AI that can help you, okay, reach higher order learning outcomes in your courses. And I'm going to show an example. I hope Per doesn't mind. It's actually from one of your classes that you taught before that you presented a while back in an X talk. And hope you don't mind that I'm using your own example. But just to illustrate this, so this is a class called Lost in Translation. And in this class, students are exploring the tension between accuracy and overall meaning in translation. And so in a previous iteration of this class, before AI, introduction of AI, students were asked in one of the assignments to translate a piece of text and then to write a reflection on their translation and how the choices that they made either reflect this accuracy versus overall meaning theory. Okay? So after introduction of AI, before I go there, so you can see that if we think about Bloom's taxonomy, this is the kind of assignment that emphasizes creation as well as analysis. And there's a little bit of evaluation too, because the students are having to justify their own choices. So in a post-GenAI iteration of this assignment, their students are now having to generate, in addition to their own, right, a version of their translation using a GenAI tool. And then they're having to compare and contrast and provide rationalization for the decisions that the GenAI could potentially make. So one could argue that if we look at Bloom's taxonomy, we see a lot more evaluation in this kind of instance, right, an analysis than we saw in a previous version. And this model of giving the AI the same task that you're having to do yourself and then making comparisons between your own output and that of the AI is a common way that we think about how to use AI to sort of engage students in more critical thinking skills. Okay. Now, there are a lot of limitations and a lot of risk associated with the usage of AI. So I don't want to give you the perspective that all is hunky-dory, and let's talk about those next. So if we step back, right, what learning outcomes might remain relevant now that we have introduced AI into education at large? And what should we be considering? So one thing I want to talk about, which has been brought up quite a lot already, is that to be able to do higher order cognitive tasks, you need to have mastered some foundational knowledge. And some of that is actually being able to be a good evaluator of the output that AI gives you. And this concept that AI is best for experts, really is mirrored by this particular statement there. So you can't create or design, right, an experiment if you do not understand the fundamentals of the system that you're testing. That's pretty clear. Okay, another thing to keep in mind is this concept of automaticity. So automaticity is the internalization of procedures, right, and rules that allows us to be really proficient and efficient when we do something. And automaticity does require a lot of practice with skills. So not only does it improve efficiency, but it allows for better retention of future related content. And in addition, it increases our cognitive capacities. What do I mean by this? So when we haven't automated something yet ourselves, and we're always having to recreate it and think about it consciously, what happens is we're using a lot of our working memory, right, to do that. And that doesn't leave a lot of space. Our working memory is quite limited. Doesn't leave a lot of space for us to be able to engage in other things. So by actually increasing automaticity, we can decrease the amount of cognitive load and therefore increase our resources to be able to tackle more complex things. And automaticity is important because we do not want to disrupt that. We want to be able to encourage our students to automate procedures and rules, and when we introduce AI could be detrimental to that process. So a good analogy might be that we do not want to we don't want to introduce calculators in third grade when our students are first learning, right, how to multiply and divide, and they're internalizing those rules. We want to delay that process when the students are ready for that. Now, this next one, it may be perhaps more relevant for our more senior students, undergraduates and graduate students, and also relevant for us, I think, to all keep in mind, is that once you reach some sort of level of expertise, to maintain it, we have to be able to continue practicing that expertise. I think we all intuitively sort of understand this, that we don't remember things that we don't practice, right? So good data comes from this recent paper that measured the ability of physicians to be able to detect precancerous polyps. Okay, before and after the introduction of AI-assisted colonoscopies. So what they saw was the ability of physicians, of gastroenterologists, to be able to detect polyps decreased when they were doing non-AI-assisted procedures after the introduction of AI-assisted colonoscopies. This was just after 3 months, okay? And the physicians here are very competent experts. They've been doing this for decades in some cases. I think the lowest was 8 years. I don't think that physicians are losing the ability, the technical ability to actually do a colonoscopy. Well, likely what's happening is their attentional skills have degraded over time because they have offloaded those attentional skills, right, to the AI. So we have to keep this in mind, right, when we're thinking about expertise development. And just thinking about expertise development only, there are a lot of other risks associated with using AI. We can think about these 3 different risks. So there's the risk of de-skilling, which we just talked about, mis-skilling, which I haven't even mentioned so far, but that's adopting errors, right, and biases of AI, something we definitely have to keep in mind. And I think the one that worries us the most, right, is never skilling, right, for most of our undergraduates, which is a failure to achieve expertise. So I think key questions to keep in mind as we are approaching course design is what skills do we need to foster, support the development of adaptive expertise. By expertise here, I really mean an expansive sense of expertise. I don't mean just being able to do a very inflexible set of skills. I really mean an expert being able to really take something from one context and apply it to other, being creative, et cetera, right? So what else do we need to keep in mind? So are there skills that we can deprioritize because they're becoming or might become irrelevant, right, without sacrificing expertise development? So I heard a mechanical engineering professor here at MIT talk about the fact that when he was a graduate student, he needed to be able to draw extremely well, and that's no longer necessary with CAD. You can do really beautiful drawings in CAD. Perhaps it's not the ability to draw, but rather to evaluate the drawing that is more important there. Right? So are there something similar in our own discipline? And if we do ask our students to collaborate with GenAI, right, what are the guardrails that we need to put in place to protect them from the erosion of expertise development or the attainment of expertise development? So we might want to look some lessons learned, right, from fields that have to grapple with balancing both cognitive offloading and skill retention. So for example, aviation's had to grapple with this conflict for a long time. What I can tell you is that pilots have to manage really complex automated systems to be able to fly a plane effectively, but they do not train in those systems. They start training in a much more simplified version of a cockpit. And in fact, they continue to train to be able to manage systems when automation fails, so they can respond, right, to failures in systems appropriately. So maybe we want to take a look at some of these challenges that other fields have faced and really think more about what it means that automation is sort of coming into our own fields to learn from them. Okay, let's return back to backward design and talk a little bit about that in-class portion, because I think this is really important, and I think many mentions of this have already happened. So active learning is engaging students cognitively during class, not outside of class, during class. And it has been shown that it has tremendous benefits across the board, with benefits for learning, benefits for retention. It also helps foster inclusion, et cetera. I would argue that what we do in the class now matters more than ever, right? How we're using that classroom time with our students really, really matters. So are you having your students routinely cognitively engaged in class? Are they solving problems by themselves or with each other? Are they answering thoughtful questions? Are they self-reflecting on things they have already done? Or peer work, for example. Are you increasing or enhancing those metacognitive skills that were mentioned earlier? And if you're not doing those things, I would encourage you to start trying and experimenting, because this really is going to be an important component of moving through the current times that we're living in. Okay. What about this concept of transparency? What is that about, and why do I need to care? Okay, so transparency is this concept of making things that normally are hidden from our students very visible. So a lot of our norms and expectations that many students do not come knowing, particularly if they don't have any higher ed knowledge or friends or family members who've been through higher ed, making those very visible. So it means you're clearly communicating your expectations, the purpose of your teaching practices, and also making it very clearly what your evaluation criteria are for your students. So let me give you an example here with assessments. What does it mean to make assessments transparent? it means moving beyond just providing a description of what the assessment is. So you also provide a rationale for that assessment. You explain the purpose, why it matters for student learning, why it might matter for those learning outcomes, and then you also give the students the criteria for success. So it is very, it's very visible for them what it is that they need to know how to achieve. We know from survey data that many students are confused about what the AI policies are, and this is probably changing a little bit as more faculty are including statements of AI policy in their syllabi. But I would say in general, because every single faculty member is able to make decisions on their own about this, students can be really confused about what's allowable or not. So at the very minimum, we should definitely have some sort of syllabi statement about what the policy is, but why it matters, right? That's one of the components of transparency, why it matters and how you might want the students to interact or not with the AI tool. But let me give you an example that goes beyond that I think illustrates elements of why transparency is so important. So this comes from Professor Laura Roberts. She teaches at WPI, and she teaches courses in the Integrative and Global Studies department. In this class, students have to do a lot of research and writing. And basically, she co-designs AI policies with her students. The main message she tries to get across is that you don't want to delegate, you want to collaborate for certain tasks with the AI tools. So what she does is she gives the students a series of case studies. Okay, so it's an in-classroom activity as she does the very first day of class. And what she does is that the case studies are representative of various stages of either research and writing. So they are, case studies about brainstorming, researching, outlining, writing, proofreading, etc. Then she puts the students in groups and asks them to discuss with one another and decide if the case study is a good representative collaboration or one of delegation. And I've actually seen the case studies and they're very nuanced, so actually they're really fantastic. And at the end, she puts together a comprehensive AI policy based on those discussions with her students. So the comprehensive AI policy has, for some tasks, the AI collaboration is permitted. For others, there is some limitations, and for some, there is prohibited. What I love about this example is that it illustrates the power of bringing your students into the conversation, right? So first of all, it gives your students agency over the AI policies. And I think that this is very powerful. They're more likely probably to follow these AI policies because there is one collective thinking behind them. And in fact, she reflected when I heard her speak about this, she said that the students have increasingly become more and more protective and more stringent, even more so than she is. She's never had to actually negotiate with her students on AI policies. I find that really fascinating. The second thing is it's allowing her to have a very transparent discussion about those learning outcomes with her students. Why might it be important to preserve some of those without AI collaboration, right? Why does it matter? That explanation will go a very long way to get her students to understand and maybe perhaps follow those actual policies. And it also helps with building classroom community, etc. Okay. I'm going to just briefly mention motivation because I think it's incredibly important. And I'm so sad I don't even have that much time to talk about it. But we talked a lot during the day about how we need to increase agency, right? Self-reflection in our students and really motivate our students to learn, to want to learn on their own, right? And not use AI as a crutch. And I think motivation here is key. We can plant a lot of seeds with wonderful backward design course objectives, right? But those seeds may not necessarily flourish or grow as much if the soil that we have, our own classroom climate and culture, does not change. So there's a lot of things that we can do, right, to intrinsically motivate our students and mitigate some of this misuse. And I want to say something because when you ask students about their motivations of why they're using AI, don't assume it's always because they just want to shortcut or shortchange their learning. Sometimes, and this has come up in some of the surveys that I've seen, students are using AI actually because other students are using AI, and the fear of FOMO, basically like not knowing what they're missing out, right? Sometimes students do not want to necessarily use AI, but they find themselves in a crunch at the end of the semester, like Eric mentioned. And so what is, right, like what are those things around the student? What's the environment around the student that is really maybe even shortchanging their own motivations and their values? So there's much that we can do. We can increase autonomy, we can increase competence, belonging, and meaning. The one I'm going to point out is competence. This has come up before, so I want to piggyback on some of the comments that have been made. So this increasing competence can be done in many different ways, but one of the ways that you can do it is rather than having students, say you have a big assessment at the very end of the course, rather than having students, just complete that assessment at the very end, you break that down into smaller components, right? So there is some sort of drafting of a proposal. Then the students have to, give you an outline. Then they have to give you, et cetera. You get the point. What that does is, one, it lowers that, it lowers the activation energy, so students are not starting at the very end. But it also makes it possible for students to do work that is their own work, right? Not necessarily have to rely on something else, because it's not about the product, it's about the process, as we talked about before. It also allows you to be able to provide feedback on those intermediate steps and for the students to improve and see that improvement is possible, right? The message you're sending here is, I believe you can do really good work, and I believe that requires feedback, and it's okay to turn in a piece that is not perfect yet, right? Those kinds of motivations will allow the students to see that it's okay when I use AI to be able to generate something. And the other thing that you can do is, allow the students, for example, to resubmit assignments or resubmit corrections without penalty. That's a kind of a grading system that allows for growth and also probably decreases the amount of AI misuse in your course. So happy to talk more about any of these things. I hope I've just given you a little bit of a taste how these learner-centered practices can really be meaningful as you navigate the current climate. And there are many, many resources. I would say we are around here to help, right? And email us, go to our website. We have a wonderful seminar speaker series that meets monthly. And we bring a lot of speakers, external and internal. We talk about AI quite a bit there as well. So make sure you sign up for our newsletter to know when those are happening. Thank you so much. Yes, Bobby. I'm happy to provide them if
Yeah, we need to ask all the speakers, we have recordings of everything, but the speakers.
I'm happy for them to be posted.
Lots of amazing information. So thank you for being a resource. The example of one of the professors had,
Yeah.
I write, and then AI writes, and then we compare. I forget who it was.
Her, yeah.
Right. So I'm wondering if you could spitball some other ideas of how to help the students really focus on that create piece inside of how we do the courses or how we do the assignments. Because I like kind of learning by example.
Yep. So another example that I have, but I didn't show, I can probably fast forward. So this is an interesting example that these are a lot of things that I created that I didn't show. But in this particular example, this is a writing class, right? So in this example, it's an example of breaking down things into scaffolded pieces, but also is an example of how to allow AI in some places and not others. So for this class, it's a class about writing in French. What the professor did was the planning and the drafting was all done in class, and there's no AI use in this particular case. But then the revising and the editing allows for AI use.
Start and then continue.
Yeah, and it's that planning and that drafting that is super important, because it's a class about finding your own voice, right, in writing in French. So I think that the revising piece perhaps is not as important of a learning outcome. So you have to think about what are your what learning outcomes you want to prioritize, right? And what are most important, what are the skills that you're actually developing in the class? And I would say for those skills that you're still developing, perhaps you want to protect those to some extent. So this is a good example of that. And then there's very specific like prompting and assistance and support that this faculty member provides, as well as a reflection for how to use the AI.
Do you have an example in an engineering class of how they used it, or in a mathematics class?
I have some other examples. I can show you after, in the interest of time.
Hello. Excuse me if you touched on this before I got here. I
Yeah,
walked in
no
a bit late. I was wondering, in one of your last slides, you talked about the idea of like having students redo assignments or having autonomy on like the type of assignments they do.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on one of the comments made by the speakers during the panel about how like these kind of frameworks are hard to do at scale? Like, do you have any suggestions on how you scale this more personalized learning when you have these MIT classes that are like 500 students and they don't even fit in a single room?
Yeah, really good question. I've seen it scale with like 100 students or so. I've seen these ability to it's, for example, physics class that is taught at Harvard by Eric Mazur utilizes specifications grading, which is a form of they're called alternative grading practices is the term to use if you want to find out more. I think it requires a lot of support, right? Because you have limited attempts in some cases. In some cases, you have some attempts to be able to resubmit assignments based on the feedback that you get. So it does require a lot of work up front, right, by the instructor. It can be done, but I think, and in some cases, probably with certain classes, that reattempting could be perhaps automated to some extent. But I think it will be hard to do a 500. I don't know. 500 seems like a really, really difficult thing to do. But a lot of classes, you can, for example, do something like you can resubmit your assignment for a portion of the grade, right? And there, you incentivize students to go back and look at their mistakes and errors, and also learn from them and not necessarily be super penalized for those mistakes and errors. And I've seen that being implemented in 6001 when that was a class here at MIT. That resubmission and reattempting with like you get like a third of portion or half portion of the homework grade. So that's one way that you can do that. But it does take a lot more engagement and involvement from the faculty and the teaching and instructional side. There's no question about that. But these are like difficult things to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Peo Wallop, and thank you first of all for the shout out. It's just came very unexpected.
It was a wonderful example.
Yeah, well, and so I have actually one remark about that, which is actually quite funny. You represented my work really, really, really well. For that, I actually really, really want to thank you. I'm also very familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, I had not thought at all when I designed what I designed about Bloom's taxonomy. And to be quite frankly, I'm actually very critical of Bloom. And I don't want to go like, I don't want to make this a graduate seminar and tell everybody what my problems are with Bloom. But you mapping Bloom's taxonomy on what I'm doing and what I've done there, and I think which was a successful thing, otherwise I wouldn't have talked or written about it, makes me reconsider that I have to look back at Bloom, because I think my problems are not so much with Bloom, but with the way Bloom has been distorted by many of us over the decades. So,
can I address that comment? Yeah, go ahead.
No. The interesting question comes now, and you can of course address that too. That's the colonoscopy study, and I find it fascinating. I heard about it the first time in December. I was at a conference in France, which is about AI in medical education, and there's in the medical sector, and there are huge overlappings between education as a sector and the medical field as a sector, as like we kind of think about how to make AI it worth. So anyways, we discussed this study, and I found it very, very sobering. But I think it also can, in a weird way, inspire us to think about the way this occurred in professional practice. It didn't occur in trying to become a better doctor. And what some of the participants at that conference in France reflected on is if doctors are okay at detecting cancer, if AI is by this time better than doctors in many contexts. But it has been always this baseline assumption until very recently that AI plus doctor is even better than that. So, but what if the colonoscopy procedure or the way the human doctor interacts with the AI system is not only aimed for optimizing the number of cancers that should be detected, which is, of course, the one thing that really, really, really counts. But how can we think about co-optimizing it so that the interaction that the doctor has on a regular basis with a superior system on detecting the cancer makes also the doctor ultimately better at independently of that technology detect the cancer. We didn't find a good solution on that, but I think there are people who look at this. I mean, I'm so glad that you came with examples from the medical field, where there are challenges that are very, very, very similar to the challenges that we are facing when we think about the whole notion of AI use in education and de-skilling. So. Anyways, that was also not a question, so, but I'll leave it like that. Thank you.
If I'm allowed, I'll make a couple of comments if I have time. Yeah? Okay. So in that study, there was actually not everybody got worse with AI. Actually, there were some physicians who got better with AI. So what about them? And I think we can look perhaps in aviation as well. So automation in aviation has made aviation way more safer. Similar to the fact that when you have AI-assisted colonoscopy, I think the research suggests something like 25% more polyps are detected because it can see very, very tiny, very, very small polyps that the human eye has a harder time detecting. So I think the thing is not to to go back necessarily, right, to a system in which we're having pilots, driving planes that are, old school, right? I don't think that's what we're trying to do here. But think more about what can physicians do, right, to be able to do better with the technology or improve their skills and not necessarily degrade the skills. And I think that thinking about maybe taking automation at times and going back and doing the skills without that kind of training, going back to your original training might help with that. And then about Bloom's, I would say I tell this to my students all the time, my graduate students and postdocs. This is a flexible tool. There are a lot of misconceptions and misuses of the tool, and I tell them what some of those things are. But use it flexibly to be able to help you articulate those learning outcomes, right? Don't use it to say, okay, my learning outcome has to be at this level, and then another one at this level. Use it flexibly, and I think if you use it flexibly, it can be helpful and useful. But I can talk more about that afterwards if you would like. Yeah, thank you.
One last question, quick.
Yeah, it sort of builds on this and Bloom's taxonomy. There's a lot of talk today about, we're teaching these higher level skills and that's what comes out of education. And yet to be an expert, architect, surgeon, whatever, you have to have a lot of disciplinary knowledge.
Yes.
And we seem to live in an age where, God forbid, anyone should have to memorize anything or know the material or do rote exercises. And yet you can't be a good surgeon unless you've, one, done a lot of surgeries.
Yes.
And two, you can't be in the middle of surgery like ChatGPT, what's the spleen do?
Exactly.
I mean, so how do I, in class, incorporate rote knowledge in a way that students are, I don't want to sit there and use class time to have them do grammar exercises or whatever, but if I don't, they'll go home and ChatGPT and what's, so I'm just wondering if you can comment on the lower levels of Bloom's technology in the age of AI.
Yeah, I think that's why I brought up this concept of automaticity. And I also talk with our graduate students and postdocs quite a bit about this. I think those lower level skills are really important, as you said, to build on higher level skills. I think we want to move away from our courses that are only emphasizing those. And those do exist. Maybe not at MIT as much, but in many places there are courses that are just doing that, those 3 bottom levels, right? We want to have a mixture of those, and probably the emphasis should be a little bit tilted more on those higher order cognitive skills. So maybe you, for example, assess some of these things in quizzes, but not necessarily in exams as much, right? Or if you do, it's a very small portion of the grade. Higher portion of the grade is really, in the assignments that are evaluating the higher cognitive order tasks from Bloom's. So that would be my advice for how to manage those things. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so you may have noticed that the agenda has some vague thing about breakout something on it. We decided that we had too many people to do actual breakout sessions, but we did want to have a little bit of a interactive session here. So I thought what I would do is to engage the audience a little bit. Sorry, I'm just looking for this. If we could put the slides up. Maybe. I will say, one of the things that I worry a lot in teaching people engineering and this sort of maintaining, thinking about the doctor, the colonoscopy and the pilot, I think I worry a lot that we're training, that one of the things that AI is doing, and you saw this in some of the comments from Daniel's students, is that we're teaching students, we're sort of taking the fun out of the building and the engineering, and we're just like humans, all that's left for humans is to be the last line of defense in case the AI gets something wrong. There's sort of like, your job is to make sure that you're the guy who's on the hook when the colonoscopy bot gets it wrong, and you're the person who's going to get sued for malpractice, and not, there's this world in which we're sort of moving to a lot less agency for humans, and I feel like that's one of the most critical things that we as educators have to do, is to and engineers and everything else, is create systems that include humans in a way that is makes their jobs interesting and fun still. So, all right. So what we're going to do here, I just thought it would be kind of fun to get everybody engaged. So if you all could pull out your phones or your laptops or whatever, and go to this URL, or you can go to the QR code. It's the same thing. I'm just going to ask some questions and kind of gauge your responses. So we're going to do a little live poll, and you just anonymously answer the polls, and then I'll flash up the answer. And I stole some of these questions from this pretty interesting paper on the AI challenge, which I'd encourage you all to go read. I think you can just Google it. But it talks a lot about how education, sort of some of the pitfalls in education, and there's a lot of disagreement about what even is okay and is not okay for people to do with AI in education. We've already heard people talking about that some today, but some of these questions we'll get to that. Okay, so if you go to this page, I see 37 of you have connected. So what I would like you to do, so there's 4 choices here. So if this works, you should now be able to choose one of those 4 choices. So go ahead and click. See that, and what I'll do is just pull up the response so we can see the responses. So 32 of you. I'll put the question. Sorry, I hid the answers. How often? It's a little tricky to do this, but hopefully you can still read it. Okay. This is a warm-up. This wasn't one of the tricky ones. I'm just, want to see if the system works. Okay, so I can publish this. Okay, so looks like sort of a mix between occasionally and very often. So maybe we didn't need the often choice, but you know, most of us are probably using it in some way. So, all right, let's do another one. So this is 5 choices. Let me go there. Okay. So how do you think increased use of generative AI will affect teaching and education? Don't overthink it. I mean, you know. Well, okay, most of you have answered, so I'll go ahead and publish it. Made it somewhat worse. Okay, so I guess that's probably not maybe not super surprising, but it's definitely a challenge, right? I mean, it's one of the things we see. All right, let's go. Yeah, people can change answers. Yeah, you can see that people are, you know, you. Yeah, it's the power of peer pressure. This thing actually has a close. I can make it so you guys can't change it anymore. All right. Let's do a few more, and then I want to open it up to audience questions. All right. Okay, so how important is it, if at all, for colleges and universities to incorporate generative AI tools into classroom activities and campus life? So this is 5 choices. There we go. Yeah, sorry. Okay, most of you have answered. I'll publish it. Okay, we got, so pretty essential, I guess. I mean, we're MIT, right? I wonder what would happen if you asked this question at Harvard, but yeah. All right. Okay. So now we're going to do the ones. These are the ones that are sort of like what I borrowed from this survey. So I'm going to give you scenarios, and I want you to say whether you think the scenario is a legitimate use of AI or cheating. And you only get 2 choices. So it's these are sort of like, I think, some of Lourdes' examples. There's actually quite a bit of gray area in these things. So, but you have to pick one. Well, I'll give you a not sure, I guess. But okay. So the first one is a student writes a paper and provides a generative AI tool with their draft, the writing assignment, and the grading rubric. And then the student asks for feedback on the paper, seeking guidance that would result in an A on the assignment, and then makes whatever edits the AI recommends. So this is an ABC. Yep.
Edits on their own or using AI?
I don't know if it matters, but you guys are having a much harder time answering this question, which maybe means it's a bad question, but yeah, I think I can. That's better. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, get your answers in. All right. I will publish it. All right. Nobody knows. Interesting. Also interesting that people are changing their answers and responses. There's a lot of waffling here. Okay. Let's do another one. ABC. Okay.
Is that cheating?
I don't know. I guess it's. Yeah. Okay. Student receives a writing assignment and asks AI to provide a detailed outline of an appropriate response. The student then follows the outline to write the paper. So this is kind of like they they, it's a variant of the previous question, but. Well.
What's the school's policy on AI?
All right, let's go ahead. Okay, more people think that's cheating. Interesting. Okay. A graduate student builds a list of relevant papers and asks an AI to summarize them into a related work section for their paper. Sorry, wait, let me reset it. Go ahead, now you can answer. More people think it's legitimate. Interesting. But still a lot of people think it's cheating. Okay, let's do, maybe, I've got a lot of these. Let's do one more. Okay, a faculty member uses, I mean, plagiarism is cheating. Yeah, I think plagiarism would count as cheating in my book. Faculty member uses generative AI tools to grade essays in their course. Okay, let's see. All right, people think that's cheating. All right. Okay, so this is an ABCD. Okay, I have personally used AI for a purpose that I believe is cheating. It's anonymous. I promise. It'll be interesting to see what the peer pressure is when we reveal this. All right. Never. Wow. I'm not sure I believe you guys. That's good. Okay, let's do one last one. This is wordy, sorry. I'll make it bigger. Okay, so which statement best reflects what you think should be the top priority for AI in education today? Here, let me just reset this thing so I don't have to bring it up. Okay. What should be the top priority for AI in education today? A, we should keep AI out of student work as much as possible. B, we should minimize the use of AI in student work, allowing it only when clearly defined. C, we should allow students to decide when and how to use AI. D, we should explicitly teach students how AI works and how it can be used appropriately and ethically. Or E, we should require students to learn, apply, and critically engage with AI tools across disciplines as a core part of the curriculum. All right. I guess that's sort of what you would expect. Most people think we should teach people to use it appropriately, so good. But a substantial minority are sort of, we should require them too, which I think is interesting. Okay. All right. So I thought maybe, I know we've had a lot of discussion already today. I really appreciate the audience's engagement, but if there are people who have thoughts either about these questions or just in general about the event or anything they'd like to share, I thought maybe we have time for maybe just spend 5 minutes. I think probably we're all a little bit worn out, but I do want to, I wanted to see if there was anybody who wanted to get a word in edgewise here.
I missed the morning session, so this might have been covered, but I don't think so. Mental health, and there's a lot of talk. It was kind of alluded to in some of the conversations about overuse of AI, not just for cognitive, detriment or debt, but also students feeling a pressure to use AI, and then, in a recent anecdote talking to a student, a feeling like, they were afraid to share their ideas, and they would go to AI for it, and AI would make them feel worse sometimes. So how do we get out of this risk of, despite the cognitive benefits, despite maybe even the practical benefits for getting a job, are they actually doing okay?
That's great. I think it's something we definitely should be thinking about. It's like if we're going to let people use AI, we need to not be making them miserable as a part of it. Go ahead.
I was going to share one too. I think part of it is stopping anthropomorphizing AI and LLMs in general. I think even in the sessions this morning, we heard a lot of like its ideas, or we're assigning real agency and real thought to LLMs, and I think that that's a really dangerous way to approach it. I don't know how to change that, but I think that might be one of the keys to protect students' mental health, by having them see it as what it is, which is an inanimate tool, despite it having the veneer of human speech.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have talked to a bunch of students that seemed like they were struggling, and I asked them how they're using AI, and they said that it helps them feel a little bit more confident because they'd be able to ask that question, like, what does that word mean that everybody else seems to know? Oh, is that an access change that you just did? Like really basic questions that their peers might know, so it allowed them to at least be a little bit on the par, and then be able to do the assignment. Because you can't necessarily, I don't mind asking questions, but not everybody will be like, wait, what's that? So I found that it actually would help the mental health if used properly, is what I was really impressed with. I saw, about 10 people I talked to last semester about this. But it can definitely have the negative side too. But.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bobby Mitra with the NEET program. Something that's occurred to me. Technology has been introduced so many times. The slide rule, anyone remember? Calculator, iPhone, iPad, laptops, So there must be parallels, because every time it's introduced, a lot of people are worried. Naturally, you don't know what's going to happen. So it might help to spread the message that AI is not bad in itself. If we take examples from the past, which people can connect to. I remember calculators came in and we were all told, hide them, can't bring them to exams, and all kinds of things happened. So.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. I think part of what a lot of what's hard about this is it's happened very, very fast, right? Like, of course, the web maybe in some ways, I guess, was a more, in terms of creating, you look at what is on the internet now and the amount of knowledge that is there versus, when at least I was in high school, it was like that was not a resource we had, right? And so it has really changed the way that people learn, but it was a change that happened over, the commercial internet happened in 97 and 95, I guess, right? In 93, late 80s was when it first became sort of widespread in universities, but it really wasn't until, I don't know, maybe smartphones or something, where it was something that mid 2000s before it was something that everybody had, right? And the sort of rise of Wikipedia was, early. It's a 10-year period where this knowledge disseminated, whereas this is a tool that's happened in 2 or 3 years, which maybe makes it feel more disruptive. But it's an excellent point that there have been lots of other big changes, and I think, every technology has its pros and cons. So, yeah. Okay, I think it's 3:15. What I would like you to do, please, if you have, I know it's late, but if you could go to this survey, that's the URL for it, or you can follow the QR code. Just fill out the survey. It's really just, we'd love to get your feedback. And also, if you're willing to share your contact information and you'd like to participate in events like this in the future, or just have thoughts, please fill out the survey. The questions are all optional, so just fill out whatever part of it you're able to fill out. We'd really appreciate it. And maybe we should mail it around, given that a lot of people have left now. So with that, I think we'll officially close. Thank you so much for coming. It's really, I've learned a ton. It's been great. I hope you enjoyed the event as well. So we look forward to doing more of these. So thanks.